cross that killed Jesus? It was a triangle. Now, this was not a triangle with 3 sharp points. It was also not a love triangle. It was a triangle between the man who, for John the Evangelist, was the Word made flesh, the Son of God, and those other 2 parties who ended up crucifying him. Jesus, in the book of John, talks of being glorified and is very aware of who he is. Because of his person, his actions, his very existence, he is a threat to those who have a particular view of God, especially to those who are charged with protecting the essential beliefs and practices of the faith, and those who have a particular view of the government and its rulers. You may remember about a year ago, we as a congregation studied the book, Creating a Healthier Church. There were many tools in that book that enable any congregation to become healthier. There are also truths in that book that have a wider application. You may remember that triangles are common in human relationships, though not necessarily healthy. There are 2 basic purposes for triangles, according to author Ronald Richardson: to absorb anxiety and to cover over basic differences and conflicts in the emotional system. They keep the issues and the responsibilities fuzzy and confusing, which helps to keep anxiety at tolerable levels, as the anxiety is shifted around from one relationship to another through triangling. Healthier relationships between 2 people or 2 parties are a result of differentiation, which Richardson equates with the biblical concept of wisdom. He says a higher level of differentiation means a person has, among other things, the ability to perceive more accurately the reality of situations, to not create threat that isn't really there, and to discern what is actually threatening and how, and the ability to identify his or her own opinions, beliefs, values, and commitments, and the principles of behavior that derive from these. Jesus was killed by a triangle, and it was most likely inevitable. The Gospel of John may show us the most clearly of all the Gospels. From the time of the beginning of Jesus' active ministry, he has stood with those who are victims, specifically victims of a particular view of Jewish law. These victims, those whom he calls in other places the least of these, had been at the vulnerable point of a triangle between the Pharisees and other religious leaders, and their interpretation of God's law in the Torah. In healing them on the Sabbath, in reaching out to those who were outcast and marginalized, he placed himself with these vulnerable people at that point of the triangle. At the same time, in being the incarnation of God's love for all people, he absorbed the anxiety and anger that was generated when he interposed himself in this way. Although he was maybe the most differentiated, wise man who ever lived, he was not able to draw out the same measure of wisdom and considered thoughts and actions on the part of others. And now, we hear tonight of his arrest, betrayal, denial, and crucifixion. I'd like you to think about his actions and the actions of those around him as the triangle becomes lethal and his death occurs. He's just prayed that the love with which he was loved by God might be in his disciples, and he in them also. In his prayer, he reveals that the unity and love which enable that level of wisdom and differentiation are the basis of his kingdom and the way he will build his church. Then, while in the garden with his disciples, Judas appears. Judas, overwhelmed with his own anxiety and doubts, has aligned himself closely with the chief priests and Pharisees in a triangle with Jesus and his disciples on the vulnerable point of the triangle. When Jesus takes control of the interaction and asks them twice, "Whom are you looking for?" they state twice in response, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus replies both times with, "I am," the Hebrew name for God, guaranteed to renew their resolve to arrest him. Then Jesus tells the crowd, "I told you that I am he, so if you are looking for me, let these men go." In so doing, he changes the triangle from Judas, the religious leaders, and Jesus with his disciples, to Jesus alone. He will be the victim of the triangle and will not carry anyone with him. Shortly afterward, when Peter is challenged as to his association with Jesus, he denies it. Jesus, as is necessary, will remain alone on that point of the triangle. We're not told in John's Passion what happens when Jesus is brought before Caiaphas, the high priest. But shortly afterward, a new and lethal triangle is formed between Jesus, the Roman authorities represented by Pontius Pilate, and the Jewish leaders. And this triangle has all the classic marks: anxiety on the part of the religious leaders and confusion on Pilate's part. Pilate tries to extricate himself from this triangle, saying, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." But the leaders continue to press him, saying, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death." Pilate then tries other things to get free of this triangle. He questions him idly, but finds no reason that he's a direct threat to Rome. He tries to use clemency to free Jesus and to free himself from this pesky triangle. But the Jewish leaders want Barabbas released instead. He has him flogged and again says, "I find no case against him." By punishing Jesus, Pilate is probably hoping to appease them and free himself from this confusing triangle. But the leaders cry for Jesus' crucifixion and say that Jesus has claimed to be the Son of God. Pilate now is afraid, the text says, probably because he realizes how high the stakes are and knows he only wants to be free from this triangle, in which his participation seems both inevitable and deadly. Pilate tries again to release Jesus, but those who have triangulated him finally hit on the one bait he will take. Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor. "Shall I crucify your king?" he asks them. And the religious leaders reply with the most damning and revealing words: "We have no king but the emperor." And he gives his consent for Jesus' crucifixion. They have just won. They have manipulated Pilate by moving closer to him, aligning their concern with his. And in doing so, they have betrayed their faith, their identity. Surely God is their king, the only king for a faithful Jew. The triangle has turned deadly for Jesus, toxic for Pilate, and the Jewish leaders have betrayed the one who has chosen to bless them from the beginning. Triangles, anxious, confusing, sometimes deadly. Jesus, knowing human beings as well as he did, manipulated events so that he alone stood on the deadly point of the triangle. He prayed for all of his disciples, past, present, and future, to be one, to be loving and wise and differentiated, maybe to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. But we still participate in triangles. Maybe that's why Jesus' crucifixion feels so personal. And although we weren't physically present, we still feel vague guilt. I could be like that, we think. I'd like to encourage you in a few moments as we venerate the cross, not to torment yourself about your complicity in Jesus' death, but instead to think unflinchingly about why Jesus had to end up on the vulnerable point of a deadly triangle. And maybe about triangles you still participate in. God is ready to help us extricate ourselves, to become wiser, less anxious, less confused, more loving.